Hello everyone, my name is Vega and I use she, her pronouns. And I'm one of the students completing the Feminist Studies honors thesis this year. So before I get into it, I would just like to give a very big thank you to Dr. Lori Oakes for the amazing guidance that she offered me throughout the process of writing this thesis. I chose to do my topic on the sexual miseducation of Downey youth and the implications of the California Healthy Youth Act in the Downey Unified School District. So in the middle of my school district back home trying to implement the California Healthy Youth Act, there was a very big uproar, and that was because there was an outside influence of conservative groups with no ties to the community that miseducated parents on what the California Healthy Youth Act would be teaching their students. So the purpose behind my research was to create an outlet for Downey Unified School District alumni to voice their concerns about restricting the implementation of the California Healthy Youth Act and to demonstrate how the successful implementation of the California Healthy Youth Act would impact communities of color like Downey, California. So for my literature review, I found a few articles on the sexual miseducation of Latinx communities, such as Lorena T. Garcia's. Secondly, I looked at connections between sexual education and interpersonal violence. And lastly, I looked at the actual legislation of the California Healthy Youth Act. So as far as my data, I used interviews because I felt that it offered students to essentially give their narrative and their story of what it was like to go through sexual education in Downey, as well as how they reflect on it now as adults. And in the interviews, I didn't introduce my topic for my thesis until the end of the interview, essentially until they were done giving their narrative to me, because I didn't want to skew what they were going to say. Two examples of some of the questions that I used are, what was the most memorable topic that you had during your sexual education content, and why was this memorable for you? Secondly, if you can change one thing about your experience with sex ed, what would you change and why? So in these interviews, I got two major themes. So first and foremost, I got sexual miseducation, and secondly, I got a lot of disclosures of interpersonal violence throughout my interviews, which is something that I was not expecting at all because I didn't ask them about their experience with interpersonal violence. Instead, a lot of alumni pretty much said because they didn't receive any education on consent, healthy relationships, unhealthy relationships, or any type of interpersonal relationships of that sort, they pretty much lived their lives not knowing the reality of what they were going through. The conclusion that I reached through my interviews was first and foremost that the California Healthy Youth Act would be beneficial to the overall development and safety of students in Downey, California. And I mentioned safety because of the interpersonal violence that I mentioned. So with the California Healthy Youth Act, it offers a form of prevention education as it offers education on consent, healthy relationships, and other forms of interpersonal violence, as well as sex trafficking. And lastly, like I said, with those cases of interpersonal violence, this really showed that there is a need for a community resource that minors can access in my hometown, because there were so many heartbreaking stories that I heard. And it really just solidified in me that interpersonal violence is so much more widespread than we really think it is, especially in high schools and middle schools. The overall significance to feminist studies, my research demonstrates the connections between sexual education and Chicana feminism, interpersonal violence, and reproductive justice. So now that my research is complete, I will be sharing a copy of my thesis with the superintendent and a school board member from the Downey Unified School District who is in charge of implementing the California Healthy Youth Act and is overlooking the entire process, because I feel that this thesis can really give them another facet to consider in trying to implement the California Healthy Youth Act, because this should be a push for them to actually implement it, because it shows that there is a need for comprehensive sexual education, as well as a prevalent disparity that is going on in our community, namely that students are saying that because they didn't receive consent education, that they experience instances of interpersonal violence.